I need somebody here right now. Somebody just came shooting in my house.
What's the address?
Somebody just came right to Avenue.
Matthew Mollicone did not arrive at Daniele Giannone's home to make a scene for neighbors or to stage a spectacle. He arrived to confront a man he believed had been involved with his wife. And he walked directly into the garage where that man was standing, closing the physical distance between suspicion and accusation in a matter of steps. There was no buffer of calm conversation before the tension surfaced, because the purpose of the visit was not reconciliation but confrontation, and the exchange between the two men escalated almost immediately once they were face to face inside that enclosed space. The garage door was open, the driveway visible beyond it, and Kimberly Mollicone remained outside near the vehicle as the men argued inside.
Get out of here, bro! Stop! Get out of here!
Danny!
I'll blow
Danny!
Stop!
Get
out of here!
Danny!
I'll blow
Stop it!
Stay away from my wife!
Stop it!
What are you here for?
Stay away from my wife!
I don't even know what the
Both men were armed. That fact alone removed any illusion that this was simply a heated discussion that might dissolve into angry words and a slammed car door, because the presence of firearms shifted the balance of the encounter from emotional to lethal before either of them fired a shot. It is not disputed that Matthew Mollicone drew his weapon first and discharged it during that confrontation, initiating a chain of events that would not stop until multiple rounds had been fired and one person lay dying in the driveway. The first shot echoed sharply inside the garage, and Giannone responded by drawing his own firearm and returning fire, the argument collapsing into gunfire so quickly that there was no visible attempt to disengage once it began. The exchange was not a single shot followed by a retreat. It was a rapid back-and-forth burst of gunfire, each man reacting to the other in seconds that allowed no room for hesitation. During this initial exchange, Giannone was struck in the leg. The injury did not end the confrontation. Instead, he moved backward, retreating from the garage into the house while still armed, and Mollicone continued firing as he advanced, pushing the confrontation beyond the original point of contact and into the interior of the residence. What had started as a dispute contained within the garage now spread deeper into the property, carrying live rounds through walls and doorways. Inside the home, Giannone obtained another firearm. He did not remain sheltered. He re-emerged from the house while wounded, and the gunfire resumed as the two men faced each other again, this time with the conflict expanding outward toward the driveway. The distance between them shifted constantly as shots were fired, neither side yielding completely, neither side stepping away from the escalation. Outside, Kimberly Mollicone was positioned near the vehicle. She had not entered the garage during the initial confrontation, and there is no evidence that she fired a weapon or directly participated in the exchange between the two men. Yet as the gunfire moved from the garage to the interior of the house and back out again, the danger radius widened, and she remained within it. As Matthew Mollicone moved toward the vehicle, still armed, Giannone fired again. One of those rounds struck Kimberly in the neck. The shift from confrontation to catastrophe occurred in that instant because the gunfire that had been directed between two men now resulted in a fatal injury to a third person who had been standing outside the original point of conflict. The movement stopped almost immediately after she was hit. The exchange that had escalated across multiple locations, ending not with surrender, but with irreversible consequence. Emergency services were called as the gunfire ceased. Deputies responding to the scene encountered two armed men who had already discharged their weapons numerous times and a woman suffering from a gunshot wound that would prove fatal. Both firearms were secured. Both men were detained. Medical personnel attempted life-saving measures, but Kimberly Mollicone was pronounced dead at the scene. Giannone was transported for medical treatment for the gunshot wound to his leg. Mollicone was placed under arrest. Investigators began reconstructing the sequence not through speculation but through physical evidence, tracing shell casings from the garage floor to the interior of the home and out into the driveway, establishing the path of the confrontation step by step through ballistic analysis and spatial mapping. The scene demonstrated movement, pursuit, and continued firing rather than a single isolated discharge. The core question shifted from what happened to why it happened in the manner it did. Authorities determined that Matthew Mollicone had gone to the property to confront Giannone over an alleged affair involving his wife, and that confrontation escalated into a shootout that neither man successfully disengaged from once it began. The evidence indicated that Mollicone initiated the gunfire, and that Giannone responded while retreating and after being wounded, continuing the exchange until the fatal shot was fired. By the end of that day, the property in Ray Township was no longer defined by the confrontation that began inside the garage, but by the homicide investigation that followed it, because a dispute that might have remained an argument instead unfolded as an armed encounter that moved across thresholds and into open space, ending with a woman dead and two men facing charges tied to every decision made in those compressed and violent moments. By the time investigators finished securing the property, the confrontation that began inside the garage had been reduced to evidence markers, numbered casings, and measured distances, each one silently documenting the path the gunfire had taken from one confined space to another, before spilling out into the driveway where Kimberly Mollicone lost her life. What had unfolded in seconds was now being slowed down frame by frame, reconstructed through trajectories and angles rather than emotion. Matthew Mollicone was taken into custody at the scene, and the narrative that would shape the case began forming almost immediately. Authorities concluded that he had driven to Daniele Giannone's home with the purpose of confronting him over an alleged relationship involving Kimberly, and that he arrived armed. That decision, to show up carrying a firearm, stood at the center of the investigation because it established that the confrontation carried lethal potential before a single word was exchanged. Giannone, transported for treatment of the gunshot wound to his leg, also faced scrutiny. He had returned fire. He had retrieved another weapon after retreating into the house. He had continued shooting as the encounter moved outside. Detectives needed to determine not only who fired first, but how the law would interpret the continuation of force once the exchange expanded beyond the garage. Ballistics testing linked the fatal shot to Giannone's firearm. That finding redirected the legal focus because although Mollicone initiated the gunfire, the round that struck Kimberly in the neck came from Giannone during the extended exchange in the driveway. The investigation therefore examined whether Giannone's actions fell within self-defense under Michigan law, or whether the continued firing crossed into criminal liability. Witness accounts supported that Mollicone had fired first inside the garage. They also established that Giannone had been struck in the leg during that initial burst and retreated into his home before re-emerging armed. Prosecutors evaluated whether the retreat created a break in the confrontation or whether the ongoing presence of an armed aggressor justified his continued response. Mollicone was charged with multiple felonies, including voluntary manslaughter and assault with intent to murder, based on his role in initiating the gunfight that led to his wife's death. The prosecution's theory centered on provocation and escalation, that by arriving armed and firing first, he set in motion the chain of events that resulted in fatal consequences, even though the bullet that killed Kimberly did not come from his gun. Giannone was not charged criminally for Kimberly's death. Investigators concluded that he acted in self-defense during an armed attack that began when Mollicone opened fire inside the garage. The determination rested on the evidence that Mollicone initiated the gunfight and continued firing as Giannone retreated while wounded, making the return fire legally justified under the circumstances. The distinction was sharp and consequential. One man initiated the confrontation and faced prosecution. The other returned fire after being shot and was treated as having defended himself during an ongoing assault. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to argue that Mollicone's decision to confront Giannone while armed transformed suspicion into lethal aggression, and that he bore criminal responsibility for the death that followed because he created the violent conditions that made it possible. The defense prepared to challenge the degree of culpability, focusing on intent, escalation, and whether Mollicone could be held legally accountable for a shot he did not fire. In court filings, the sequence of events was laid out with precision. Mollicone enters the garage armed. He fires. Giannone returns fire and is wounded. Giannone retreats into the home. Mollicone advances. Giannone retrieves another weapon. Gunfire continues into the driveway. Kimberly is struck. The confrontation ends. The jury would not be asked to determine whether a confrontation occurred or whether gunfire was exchanged. Those facts were clear. They would be asked to decide whether Mollicone's actions satisfied the legal threshold for voluntary manslaughter and related charges, and whether initiating an armed conflict carried responsibility for its foreseeable outcome. Trial testimony unfolded over 8 days. Prosecutors presented ballistic experts who explained the placement of shell casings and the origin of the fatal round, mapping the confrontation through diagrams that traced the path from garage to interior to driveway. Witnesses described the speed of the exchange and confirmed that Mollicone fired first. Medical testimony established the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the neck. The defense did not deny that Mollicone brought a firearm to the confrontation. Instead, they sought to frame the encounter as a volatile situation that spiraled beyond expectation once both men began firing, emphasizing the chaotic nature of the exchange and arguing that responsibility should not extend to a shot discharged by another individual. The prosecution countered by returning to the origin of the violence, that Mollicone chose to initiate armed force on someone else's property, and that the law recognizes accountability when a person's actions create a deadly chain reaction. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on voluntary manslaughter and additional assault-related charges. The conviction carried substantial prison exposure, reflecting the seriousness of initiating an armed confrontation that resulted in death. At sentencing, the court emphasized the irreversible consequence of the decision to arrive armed and fire first, noting that the escalation that followed flowed directly from that initial act. Mollicone was sentenced to decades in prison. The legal outcome did not reverse the events inside that garage, nor did it alter the ballistic findings or the determination of self-defense regarding Giannone. It formalized responsibility under the law and closed the criminal phase of the case with a clear allocation of culpability. What remained was the stark progression from accusation to gunfire, from garage to driveway, from confrontation to conviction, all rooted in a single decision to bring a weapon into a dispute and to use it. Witnesses testified about what they had observed in the weeks leading up to the incident. Some described tension, others described reconciliation attempts. No one described open violence. The portrait that emerged was complex and uncomfortable, a relationship that appeared functional in public but fractured in private. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was silent in a way that felt heavy rather than respectful. The prosecution stated plainly that this was not a split-second tragedy. They said it was the result of resentment allowed to simmer until it reached a breaking point. They reminded the jury that evidence does not lie, and that intention can be inferred from action. A confrontation that began behind closed doors and ended with one man dead and another imprisoned for most of his remaining life. Two names forever linked by one night that neither could undo. If you want more in-depth coverage of cases like this, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel.